Is Disney's The Little Mermaid a trans fable? Our guest today, friend of mine, Brett McCracken, is a senior editor at the Gospel Coalition, argues that the answer to that question is yes, and we're going to discuss why. We're going to look at the worldview behind the film and then take your questions. So write them down, state them at the end. We'll take your live questions for Brett. Now, Brett, it's good to have you back. Last time we were on, we analyzed the film of the Batman and some ideas behind that. A lot of people said, have him back on. And this, when I saw your article in the Gospel Coalition, I instantly thought, what a fascinating article. It's Pride Month. A lot of people are talking about this issue. Let's discuss it. But I'll be honest with you, I was somewhat hesitant to do this interview just because even the title is The Little Mermaid, a trans fable, can feel like an attack from some people. It can feel like we're reading something in that's not even there. It could be deemed hateful. That is the last thing I want to communicate. I want to look at the worldview behind this film. It seems that even many LGBTQ advocates consider this a cult classic. In fact, an article in the Gay Times in the UK said, quote, referring to this movie, often reduced to mer girl meets boy, queerness is actually an integral part of the Little Mermaid story and has been since 1837. So you're not just arbitrarily reading something into this that other people haven't found, are you?
Right. Yeah. I don't set out to write these articles just, to be provocative. And I admit that headline is The Little Mermaid, a trans fable, is provocative. And it's really an invitation just to ask that question. And I don't think the answer is obvious, but I think it's worth asking that question, especially given the history of The Little Mermaid, like you just mentioned, which does kind of have an interesting intertwined history with the LGBTQ movement, really going back to Hans Christian Andersen's original, which some literary scholars, kind of read some themes of queer desire into that. And we don't have to get into that, but you can Google that and read a bunch of that content if you want. And then the 1989 Little Mermaid, there's interesting things like Howard Ashman, who was a famous Disney lyricist who wrote lots of the songs that people will be familiar with from classic Disney movies of the 80s. He was an openly gay man. He died of AIDS. He wrote songs like Part of Your World, which has become a little bit of an anthem in the LGBT movement. And then one of the most interesting things about Little Mermaid is the character of Ursula, who wasn't in Hans Christian Andersen's original story, was introduced for the 1989 animated film. And that character was very explicitly based on a drag queen named Divine, who was kind of a famous drag queen in the 80s. And the character of Ursula is herself kind of this LGBT, trans-esque icon character. So yeah, there's lots of history there. And this new version, you read movies through the lens of the moment where you're in culturally. And I don't think that in 1989 the transgender conversation was as big of a thing. So we weren't looking at movies kind of seeing that. But now we are, right? There's few bigger conversations in our culture right now than the transgender question of kind of becoming not only whoever you want to be, but whatever you want to be in terms of your gender changing. And so this is a live conversation in our culture, and it's fair, I think, to read The Little Mermaid through that lens and at least ask that question of do the presuppositions behind that worldview show up in this film, even if The Little Mermaid isn't overtly saying, yay, transgenderism, it's not talking explicitly about it, but I argue in my article that there's some themes there that have kind of the presupposition worldview.
Well, we're going to get into that. And I appreciate that you're saying this is one way of reading it. You're not saying this is the definitive only way to look at this. But it's not just you, evangelical Christian, reading this into the film. There are a number of folks who are not Christians and who are not evangelicals who actually have been saying that the same things are present. Now, on the flip side, One of the things that I think there's a little bit of a tension here. One is to find what themes are actually in the film and not read into it. But I also think there might be some people looking for certain themes to say this is more present than you realize, this is normalized to push a certain worldview and ideology. So there's kind of that tension between the two that exists. Would you agree with that tension?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you read a film, there's multiple levels that you can engage it on. There's the kind of overt level of what is the film clearly trying to say,
Okay.
and what does the filmmaker want every audience member to leave, without a doubt as the
Mm,
takeaway. And that's one important level that we should think about. But I think most films, even if the filmmakers aren't consciously advocating certain things, most films carry with them presuppositions about the world and ideas about the world and values about the world that inform the story and how it's told. And I think that's equally an important level to look at, and that's kind of the one I'm focusing on in my
mm,
review, not necessarily the conscious uh, level of like, here's what we're talking about here, what we're advocating for,
okay.
more on the subtler level. And I would argue Christians need to be a little bit more alert to those
Mm,
that subtler level, because we kind of freak out about the obvious offenders. We can talk about this more, but like, the strange worlds, the Buzz Lightyear movies where there's like a gay kiss or whatever, like those are the ones that Christians tend to be up in
mm,
arms about. But sometimes I think it's the more subtle stories in kids' movies that are informed by worldview assumptions that might on the surface seem innocuous, and it actually might seem like good, valuable ideas. But if you kind of dig deeper and really think about it, there might be some problems there that can lead that can be upstream from something like transgenderism in our culture becoming more acceptable.
interesting. Now, there's already some comments of people coming in saying this is a stretch. I don't see it. Got more thumbs down than normal. In some ways, people aren't even hearing out the case and are already reacting, which is how these conversations often take place. So we
Yep.
will get to your case. I'd invite people to hear it first and then respond thoughtfully, agree or disagree. You're right that this is an ongoing conversation. Now, I don't know how I missed this, maybe because I hadn't seen the movie in a couple decades, but when you started talking about how, according to many in the LGBTQ community, see this movie and the song like a part of your world as kind of a
Mhm.
cult classic, one response by people who don't share that worldview is to be critical. My first response is to say, well, that's interesting. What is it within the film that many people in this community gravitate towards? Because honestly, Brad, if you look at the films that I love, there's certain things you could just know about me that are autobiographical, about my heart, about my experience. For example, I'll throw it out there. I literally love the movie Rocky 3 and I love Infinity War for reasons we won't go into, but someone could psychoanalyze me and learn certain things about me by looking at those films. So when I look at
Yep.
this, before I criticize it, I think, okay, like, have I understood why so many people find this movie compelling? And does this
Mhm.
give me a glimpse into better understand their heart and their experience so I can just love them as my neighbor? So before we get to any kind of critique, do you share that sentiment or do you see anything else in the popularity of this film that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I think it's important to empathize with audiences and why they resonate with films, and understand, on a human level, what is it that clicks here? What is it that resonates? And, you know, I think universally the basic theme of wanting something, desiring something that is a little bit out of reach or seems out of reach, is something all humans everywhere have experienced, that kind of that impossible dream, that impossible desire. Um, so it's universal on one hand, but I think especially maybe one of the reasons why the Little Mermaid has become a beloved film for LGBT communities is, Ariel, her character is this misunderstood young
Mm,
woman who who wants this thing that is forbidden. It's forbidden love. It's a type of love that isn't that's frowned upon, right, by her parents or by her father, by her community. This kind of mermaid human love off limits. The culture does not say that that's okay, and yet for her it's a real desire. And what does she do with that? Does she suppress that desire? Does she ignore it? Does she just go with kind of what her father is saying? Ariel, you can't, under no circumstances can you like pursue this desire. And I think that that's probably the experience of a lot of people in the LGBT community. They feel misunderstood. They feel like they have to suppress something in their desires because it's not normative in a sense in the culture. And so it makes sense that Ariel would be a character that resonates with people in that community.
I'm curious if you find anything else in the movie that's redemptive and positive that we can celebrate before we get to some of our concerns and our critiques. Like, for example, for me, where Ariel talks about, I want more, there's this sense of like, oh, she doesn't just want more material things. This is not
Mm-hmm.
just more money and possessions. There's this deep heart yearning that she's discontent in her state of life and needs a kind of conversion, so to speak, a new birth to
Mm-hmm.
really be satisfied in life. Well, I'm going to differ with the way it's cashed out in that film, but that overlaps really powerfully with Christian ideas of this world in itself doesn't satisfy. We need a kind of new birth and a kind of conversion. So,
Mm-hmm.
do you agree with that assessment there? Are there any other things in this film you think, we could just kind of celebrate and be positive about before we get to some of our concerns?
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's definitely virtues in the film, and what you just mentioned, I think, is a valid reading of that kind of this idea of wanting more than the ephemeral kind of things of life, wanting something more substantive. I also think about like the theme of friendship and how the bird, what's his name, Scuttle, I think,
Mm,
and Sebastian and Flounder. They're friends that stick with her, and
mm,
that even though their kind of reputations are on the line, the theme of community and friendship, I think,
mm,
is a good
mm,
theme. And then Triton, we can talk about his character more later because his character really figures into my reading of the film through this trans theme. But I think a good aspect of his character is just the sacrifice that he demonstrates
mm,
in the end of the film when he literally gives up his life to
mm.
save his daughter who had gotten into this predicament. That's a laudable virtue, fatherly sacrifice. So, yeah, so there's plenty in the film that's commendable, and it's an enjoyable film. It's well done artistically. The acting, everything is well done. I really loved the cast and the different personalities that were new in the cast. So yeah.
Speaking of the cast, there was some criticism. I don't think just from Christians, I think from a bunch of people about kind of the race conscious casting. Does that
Mhm.
concern you? Should Christians spend any time talking about that, or should our concern be elsewhere?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we should spend time critiquing that. For me, that's, maybe there's some parts of it that feel a little bit forced, like all the Mer daughters of Triton are a different ethnicity, and that
Fair
feels a
enough.
little bit a little bit over the top. But in general, I think it's a good thing in Hollywood that there's more
Mm,
diverse representation happening. And I saw the movie in a theater with, families bringing daughters of different ethnicities, and I knew
mm,
what the film like this meant for them,
mm,
right? To be able to see themselves in a character like Ariel
mm,
uh, in a new way, right? That's powerful and that's a good
mm.
thing. And I think Christians should celebrate diversity and the valuing of all ethnicities. So I think that is, even though a lot of the press around the film and controversy around the film has been on that front, I think that that's not where we should spend our energies as Christians. It's the subtler things. It's
Okay.
the idea
Yeah.
level kind of themes that we need to think about. Okay,
Mm.
is what this film is advocating actually good, and might there be negative outworkings of it in certain ways?
Well, let's start shifting towards that. But kind of the backdrop of this analysis is that it's been very clear that Disney has a progressive cultural agenda. We probably don't have a lot of need to spend a lot of time on this, but
Yeah.
what is that progressive agenda? What have they said? And what have they been doing in their films more explicitly over the past few years?
Yeah. Yeah, it's if 5, 10 years ago we suspected this was the case with
Mm,
Disney films, now it's just out there, right? There's been executives who have been caught on camera or audio recordings saying things like, yeah, of course we're inserting queer themes into these movies on purpose. Of course we have an agenda on LGBT characters and sexuality. So it's being stated explicitly, and you can see it again, like you just mentioned, in the films. Just in the last uh, year, we had Lightyear, the Toy Story spinoff, which had the first kind of Disney kids film same sex kiss and storyline between two women, and then
mm,
the Strange World, which came out in the fall, which was even more overt with a kind of adolescent gay character who had a love story with another boy. Um, so yeah, Disney is becoming a little bit more overt and like wanting to represent this and wanting to normalize it as a good thing that, young kids watching these films, if they see this enough, they're going to be like, yeah, of course, this is normal and love is love. And, it's a good thing. And
mm,
that's what Disney is hoping, right? They know that um, if you can get young people to love characters of this sort and see them as just as you know good and virtuous as any other character in their choices, then it's going to be hard for them in real life to find any fault with
mm,
um, these alternative sexualities.
mm. There's some great questions already coming up here. So if you have a question, put in caps question. We're going to work through a little bit more of Brett's case on the Little Mermaid, and then we will shift to do your specific questions here. But let's move down. Maybe give us your 30,000 foot view response, and then we'll move to some of the characters specifically. Is Disney's The Little Mermaid a trans fable? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it's an yes or no answer. I would
Okay.
say there are ideas in the film that I think provide scaffolding, if you will, for something
Mm,
like transgenderism to be an idea that is held up as good and normal. And part of my thinking about this article is I live in California, and there's like legislation happening right now
mm,
about trans youth and parental rights. And so one of the big dynamics in the transgender movement, right, is this intentional kind of sidelining of parents, right? We want
mm-hmm.
young
Yep.
people who identify as trans to be able to make that decision on their own terms, maybe, go see a therapist and make that decisions about hormone therapy and surgeries with psychiatrists and counselors, but parents don't need to be informed and involved. So that's a key part of the trans movement is the sidelining of parents. And there's laws in California that are trying to be passed that like enshrine that idea that parents don't and can't really have
Yeah.
uh, a say against this. So that was in the back of my mind when I watched this film. And so the characters of Triton
Mm,
as the dad are really important here, and Ursula as the other adult figure. And so we can talk about that now or later if
okay.
you want. But I was thinking about this just in terms of current headlines in California, this theme of the role of parents in trans youth and what role they play,
Mm,
um, and the role of other adults in this story. And then also just knowing the LGBT kind of background of the Little Mermaid and um, just the basic elements of the plot in terms of changing your body to get what you want, right? In terms of Ariel has a desire, she wants to be something different than she is,
mm,
and she's not satisfied with the limitations that make that impossible. And so various things happen that make that possible for her, right? To kind of resolve her feeling of tension or feeling of dysphoria with
Mm,
what her body is and what her heart's desire is leading her towards. And
mm,
so I think there's numerous things that make me lean in the direction of saying, yes, this could be read as a trans fable. Is it obviously that? No. And I think it would be a
okay.
stretch to say that it's obviously about that. But I think that, again, we shouldn't read films only on the obvious level. That's a very surface level approach
Mm,
to consuming films. And we would be
agreed.
naive. We would be naive to think that unless a film is obviously advocating for something or obviously about something, then it can't be. They can't have that at all in it. And
Mm,
I think most of the powerful, insidious movies in our culture in terms of normalizing ideas happen on that more subtle kind of level where it's not overt. It's not like Strange World or Lightyear. It's more kind of a subtle advocacy for a type of worldview that makes a transgender uh, idea plausible and good.
that makes sense. So, in one of the articles that you linked to in the Gay Times in UK, which came out in May recently, makes the case that going back to 1837, Hans Christian Andersen's original writing had some
Mhm.
queer themes built into it. The 1980s update was a little bit more explicit, including the director, but then this 2023 update takes it a step even further. So let's
Mhm.
unpack some of these characters and what you see in them. For example,
Yeah.
let's start with Prince Eric. We haven't mentioned him yet. What shifts do we
Mhm.
see in his character?
Mhm. Yeah, he was an interesting one in terms of I was really watching the film trying to pay attention to what was
Hmm.
new and what was kind of emphasized differently. And a lot of the movie is basically the same as the 1989 version, but enough of it is different that it's important to kind of look at what was changed. In Prince Eric's case, he's really positioned in this kind of progressive vanguard, like leave tradition behind. We need to look ahead to the future. And so, again, there's nothing overt about like transgenderism there. He's
Sure.
Prince Eric is not like waving the pride flag or anything. But you can see how showing him as this virtuous, kind of forward thinking, we need to not be stuck in the
Mm,
past, we need to be looking forward person. That's one element of what I'm saying here
mm.
about kind of presuppositions that support the scaffolding of an idea like transgenderism.
Okay, tell us a little bit more about Triton, and then we'll get to Ursula, who is a very explicit kind of character where it's a little bit more obvious. But what do you see in Triton in terms of this shift that pushes this narrative forward?
Yeah, so his character is, a loving father. Obviously, he's protective, and I think that his protectiveness is framed both in the 1989 version and this one as well-intentioned, but kind of repressive. Right? It's this like father who doesn't understand his daughter, and by the end of the film, he's come to this point of admitting, yeah, I was wrong to be protective in this way. I should have listened to you. Your voice should have never been silenced. That was one of the new
Mm,
lines at the end of the film that I don't remember
mm,
being in the 1989 version. He says something to the effect of
mm,
like, I should have listened to you all along. And again, I think this plays into the trans movement's emphasis on parents are an obstacle to
mm,
children kind of becoming who they are because protective parents who don't necessarily love the idea of their daughter or their son altering their body because they have this
mm,
idea that they want to be someone different. That's a wrong-headed inclination for a parent. That's You're actually going to do more harm to your child by
right.
preventing them from kind of where their heart is leading them. And Triton
Mm,
is framed that way. He's framed as like doing harm to his daughter insofar as he prevents her from this, transition that she wants to live in the human world, to leave behind her mermaid biology and
Mm.
become something different than what she is. And yeah, at the end of the film, there's this kind of speech of total affirmation to his daughter, where he's like
Mm.
tearfully saying, like, Ariel, like, I'm sorry I ever doubted you. You were right. This is who you are. And, I'll miss you, but this is for the best, that you've moved on and received what you wanted, you know, all along.
It's a brilliant cinematic line to talk about her voice being
Mhm.
silenced because it's her physical voice, but it's also this perspective needs
Yeah.
to be heard by
Yeah.
those who are resisting and holding on to tradition for the sake of tradition and not realizing that there's kind of more progressive ideas that should be embraced. So I think that cinematically, even though I disagree with the conclusion, that was
Mhm.
a somewhat of a brilliant line to put in there.
Yeah.
Let's move to Ursula, who is more explicitly a
Hmm.
character that advances this narrative.
Hmm. Yeah. So I talk about Ursula in the film. For me, in terms of the transgender, like what's happening in our culture, she's like the therapist, or the person
Mm,
that the young person goes to when she doesn't have any other adult who will listen. Her parents aren't listening, so she has to go to an affirming adult, a
mm,
therapist who will give her what she wants. In this case, I want to become a human so I can pursue this romance with Prince Eric. And Ursula is more than happy to oblige, and she's more than happy to do the magic, or prescribe the medicine, if you will, to make that transition happen. And she's like the adult who isn't a parent, but kind of undermines Ariel's actual parent, in a really scary way that I think is playing out a lot in our culture right now on this question of transgenderism. There are adults out there, both in the psychiatry field, but also politicians, who are more than happy to push young people, who are experiencing gender dysphoria, in the direction of, embrace who you are. This is a good desire. Let's make it happen for you. Um, Whereas their parents might beg to differ and want something different. But again, sidelining the parents, removing parental rights from the equation, is a big part of this story. And you see it in The Little Mermaid, I think, in a really interesting way.
when I saw the 1989 version, it didn't even cross my mind that she was potentially a drag queen. It wasn't even on my radar. I was probably in
Yeah.
junior high anyways, and culture was in a very different spot. But in this
Hmm.
article in the Gay Times out of the UK, they talk about
Hmm.
how her character was explicitly based on a drag queen. I think the name was Divine or Divine
Yep.
Love, something to that effect. And the idea is that she kind of performs femininity a little bit rather than femininity being expression of your biology and who you are. It's
Yep.
something you perform. So for
Yep.
Ariel to win Eric, here's a performance that you do to
Hmm.
win him over.
Yep.
Some of those themes are enough to give me pause and go, that's really interesting. There are certain ideas
Yep.
embedded within this film.
Yeah, just the very idea of gender as a performance, that anyone can kind of pass as whatever gender they want to by emphasizing these stereotypical feminine or masculine traits. That's what drag is, right? It's putting on a costume of the accentuated aspects of a particular gender. And
Mm,
even Ursula, with her like flotsam and jetsam eels, they're kind of like feather boas that she's like cavorting around with these eels. That's like classic like drag queen behavior. So yeah, it's that. So her character is sort of like, yeah, this idea in a nutshell of gender performance, even if it isn't necessarily tied to biology.
mm. We're going to come to your questions. So if you have a question, get it ready. Put question in caps, and then we'll come to it in a little bit. I have a few more for you, Brett. One being, you've said this probably 2 or 3 times, that it's actually more subtle movies like this that concern you more than like
Mhm.
Lightyear or Strange World, where there's these kind of obvious kisses or relationships. And you know what's interesting about this is I teach a class. I still do a high school class, a
Mhm.
Bible class outside of Biola. and we watch films, and I do movie analysis. It's one of my favorite things. And I tell my students, I say, look, when you're in a political speech or a sermon, you know someone's trying to persuade you. But when it comes to a film, we let down our guard and just assume, oh, it's just entertainment. But it affects our affections in ways we don't even see. One of
Mm-hmm.
my favorite classes at Biola when I was a comm major was on persuasion. And a line I'll never forget was the most effective persuasion is when you don't even know you're being persuaded to believe something. I thought, wow, that means I better be paying attention.
Yep.
Music, movies, relationships, etc. So it sounds to me like you have more concern with some of the narratives in things like The Little Mermaid than Toy Story or Lightyear, which is just kind of in your face.
Yeah, I think it's not that those films aren't concerning.
Mm,
I'm not going to let my kid turn on, A Strange World on Disney Plus. So there is an element of caution that we should still have about those. But I think a lot of parents are alert to that already, and it's telling. I think that both of those movies, Strange World and Lightyear, were box office flops. People didn't take their kids to see those movies because they knew that there were these elements in them. So that's why I'm a little bit more concerned about the subtle films where parents aren't,
mm,
um, it isn't on their radar that they should be concerned necessarily, because it's a Little Mermaid, right? We grew up
of
watching this, and
course.
it's about a nice mermaid. It's a Hans Christian Andersen, fairy tale, whatever. It's what's problematic here. So it is. I think it's just an invitation generally for us as Christians to think a little bit more deeply about the movies we watch, and again, go beneath the surface of the obvious reading
Mm,
and the obvious argument that the movie is making, and think about what are the like inherent values and presuppositions at play here, that we're picking up over time. That maybe shaping our hearts, like you said, shaping our affections in ways that aren't super helpful.
mm,
And I think in a lot of Disney movies, for example, I think there's this basic value of wanting something that is forbidden or off limits, and just wanting to kind of be true to your heart's desire. And so there's this inherent valuing of desire, as if like desire is always just on the account of it being
mm,
a real desire that you feel, that it's good, and that you should pursue it. And anyone who stands in the way of that is kind of a villain in some way. And that
mm,
right there is a problematic value to kind of inculcate, because all of our desires are not good. And it's actually a gift sometimes to have people in our lives, whether friends or parents, who push back a little bit on our desires and cause us to kind of, um,
mm.
you know, reconsider that. And I was thinking about the Hans Christian Andersen, original, and the claims that that story had queer elements, because there's like a letter. There were some letters that apparently he wrote to another man at the time that he was writing the
Okay.
little. He was writing letters to a male friend, and using language of romantic desire for him
Mm,
that apparently wasn't reciprocated
mm.
from this guy. Now, I'm not a historian, so I don't want to like make any claims about
Sure.
whether whether Hans Christian Andersen was whatever his sexual nature was, but here's the thing: in his time, it was a very Christian culture where the idea that every desire you have is inherently good and should be
Mm,
acted upon, that just wasn't an accepted idea. So he might have had those desires, and it might have come out in private correspondence, and it might even have informed his writing of The Little Mermaid. That it
mm.
may have been the case that The Little Mermaid was sort of telegraphing his um, frustrated desires that weren't being reciprocated, or maybe there was an aspect of forbidden love in his own life. I don't know.
Okay.
But
Interesting.
the point I'm trying to make is that in his
Mm,
time, in his cultural context, it just wasn't like the idea that your desires should be acted
Mm.
upon, however forbidden they might be, it wasn't an assumption. It is an assumption now, thanks to lots of movies that have kind of had that value that like desire is good. Desire is who you are, actually. Your identity is bound
Mm.
in your sexual desires, and anyone who challenges that is not only challenging your desires, but challenging who you are as in your very essence, and that's a threat, right? Um, that's an aggressive threat to your very personhood. So it just shows
Hmm.
you how like the messages that shape a culture are powerful to change our values and our presuppositions, and that's why we have to pay attention, I think, to the subtle level here of movies.
In some ways, Hollywood and Disney have been kind of pushing the idea of following your heart for decades, long before this conversation about sexuality is there. And we should have been paying attention back then. And in some
Yeah.
ways, not surprised that we see this in films because it's an extension of the
Hmm.
ideas that have been there for a long time. Now, I
Hmm.
posted that we were having this conversation on Instagram and got this response. And I'll give you my 2 cents. Want to know what you think. Is
Hmm.
somebody asked back and said, so I asked the question, is Disney's Little Mermaid a trans fable? Somebody
Hmm.
commented and just said, is Beauty and the Beast a bestiality fable? Is X-Men about homosexuals are oppressed by other humans? Now, there's no tone in this, so these could be legitimate questions, or it could be the person is just
Right.
mocking me saying this is ridiculous. I don't know. But when I look at like Beauty and the Beast, for example, I
Hmm.
watched the live action with my students and we analyzed it. And
Hmm.
my conclusion is that underlying this film is actually some deep Christian ideas. The
Hmm.
idea being that this man at the beginning, the king, is so proud and haughty. He
Yeah.
has to be humbled, right? Hence the curse. And what this curse does is it creates physical thorns around the very place in which they live, which we see, of
Hmm.
course, in the garden. And he
Yep.
doesn't actually become a beast, but he's losing his core humanity, becoming more beast like, so to speak. And if he isn't set free by true love, then he will fully become a beast. And of
Mm.
course, it's only when he sees the girl, my mind just went blank. Oh my goodness, how can I forget her name? Who's the heroine in the story, who he truly says, go home and save your father. He's able to let go and loves her, that
Mm.
he's actually set free from this curse.
Mm.
I mean, the kiss at the end of that movie that a lot of people got hung up in, I knew at that point was Disney saying, we're going to kind of test the waters and see if what we can get away with. But
Mm.
if we just step back and look at the larger themes of that movie, I think it's screaming with Christian ideas all through it that we should
Mm.
discuss and highlight. Do you agree, or do you see that a little differently?
No, I agree. I think the way you're reading that is very viable, and I think yeah, I don't think we can approach every Disney film as if they're all trying to advance the
Mm,
exact same kind of agenda. Um, that's a lazy way of looking at films.
mm,
Each one needs to be looked at on its own terms, and I think there's some value in kind of looking at trends that span multiple films, but ultimately, you can't impose a narrative on films just to kind of make it work with your narrative. So
mm,
I would want to look again at the Beauty and the Beast on its own terms, and it might be
mm,
that that film actually goes against some of the Disney's own ideas,
mm,
and pushes a an interesting Christian kind of idea like you're describing. So yeah, and not all Disney movies are made by the same people, and
that's fair.
there's a lot. We can sometimes talk about Disney like a monolith, or any movie studio as a monolith, but the reality is a lot of these movies have very different creatives involved, and so the ideas are naturally a little bit different, and even the worldview presuppositions can be slightly different. So
Mm. A number of people commented, Belle, of course, is her name. Not sure how I missed that one, obvious. But even that movie, Beauty and the Beast, is about what is real beauty and
hmm.
what is real ugliness. And it's
Hmm.
contrasting Gaston, who has outward beauty, with the
Yeah.
beast who does not. but
Yep.
Belle uncovers this real beauty in his life. That's really the contrast that's going on. There's so many beautiful biblical themes within that, even though I doubt that's what Disney is trying to advance.
Yeah.
Okay, so a question that I know a lot of people are asking is this question, very practical. So, Brett, you work at the Gospel Coalition, you analyze films, but I just need to know, do I
Mhm.
take my kids to see this movie or not? Your
Mm.
take, and then I'll give you mine.
Yeah, my answer to that is I think you should still take your kids to see it.
Hmm.
There's nothing overtly objectionable that I think is going to damage your child. But here's what I say as the like caveat with that: be sure to discuss it afterwards with your child, and maybe you can bring up some of the themes and the ideas that I
Hmm.
talked about in my article that could be potentially wrong-headed ideas. And you know, whether or not you bring up the trans part of the discussion, I'll leave that up to parents, to use their discretion. But the bigger worldview questions should be discussed. And I think in general, my posture with movies is yes, I think it's okay to watch them as long as you're a parent who is actively engaging your child in unpacking the movie afterwards and not just kind of like, let's watch a movie, let's have an entertaining experience, and then let's leave and, move on. Like
Hmm.
that is where it's a little bit negligent as a parent to just kind of expose your child to this and then
Hmm.
not follow up with them to say, okay, what were the good, like just like we've been discussing, what were the virtuous aspects of this
There
film?
you
Who
go.
who are the commendable characters? What can we as Christians praise about this? But what are some things in this movie that maybe we would disagree with and we should probably question as Christians? And that's just a good habit for any movie that we see as Christians, adults, and as Christian parents of young kids. That's my posture as a critic
Yeah.
of movies. I'm always looking for things I can praise, things I can celebrate by common grace, and things that I should call out as problematic.
Very similar to my posture. When that movie Bohemian Rhapsody came out about Queen, my son at the time was 14, wanted to see it. I was like, okay, buddy, I just
Hmm.
want to talk about it with you afterwards. So we went,
Yeah.
we sat down. What's
Right.
positive? Did you ever feel preached at? Great conversation. When I was in
Yeah.
high school, my dad took us to see Schindler's List. My
Hmm.
girlfriend at the time was actually my wife. We went to Sizzler Steakhouse afterwards and probably talked about it for 2 hours. I
Hmm.
think movies, ones we agree with and don't agree with, are wonderful opportunities to talk with kids.
Yeah.
The only nuance where I might see it a little bit differently is I think parents can take their kids to it, but there's a lot of people who say, I don't want to give a penny to
Yeah.
support Disney. If that's your conviction, don't do
Yeah.
it. I'm not going to tell you to
Yeah.
spend money where you shouldn't, but
Yeah.
don't not see it because of ideas embedded in the film affecting your kids. I see it as a wonderful opportunity to help your kids think Christianly about
Mhm.
it.
Yeah.
Um,
I agree with that for sure.
let, let me bring in this comment here and just get your take on this. Uh, Pamela says, "Good Lord, do you guys not have anything else to do but impose your frustrated ideologies and feelings about the culture war onto Disney movies? This is ridiculous." Now, here's what I would say. I would say,
Hmm.
Pamela, thank you for watching. Thanks for chiming in. I get it. Is it possible that you didn't see the beginning of this, where we're trying to approach this graciously, positively, but just bring a balanced Christian worldview to this film that we would to other films? That's my duty as a Christian. And I would actually say, if people who are of a different worldview as I am, or who are maybe in the LGBTQ community, if they took a Christian film and
Hmm.
approached it the way that we're approaching this, I would actually feel honored and feel good about it. So I'd like to know exactly where we have gone wrong in this analysis and why we're making this a culture war. I just
Hmm.
don't see it. Your thoughts, Brett?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that it's we're not imposing a culture war on this conversation. Like Disney, on their own admission, right, as we talked
Mm,
about earlier, they are engaging in advancing their cultural worldview through these films. And it's a worldview that is at odds with Christian ideals about
Hmm.
things like sexuality and gender. And if we know that, if it's a kind of known fact that Disney, through its films, is advocating a worldview that is not doesn't line up with what we believe as Christians, then to have this conversation isn't to impose anything on anything. It's just to
Hmm.
like receive what has been said is happening with Disney movies and trying to have eyes to see the the subtle layers to that, not just the overt layers to that
Hmm.
in movies like Strange World and Lightyear, but the subtle ways that this kind of stated agenda is being borne out in Hollywood output. And I don't know if we even mentioned this, but the director of The Little Mermaid, Rob Marshall, is himself a gay
Hmm.
man. So
Hmm.
when we talk about filmmakers and the perspectives they bring into the creative process of filmmaking, you know, it's an important fact to know that the director of this Little Mermaid remake is himself a gay man, right? So he has a vested interest in making a film that might kind of subtly support some of the presuppositions that lie
Hmm.
behind our culture's shift on sexual ethics.
So, are you more concerned with some of these specifically components that seem to line up with certain trans ideology as opposed to the larger worldview of the film? I pulled up this blog and they kind of describe what The Little Mermaid is about. And it said, here's the theme. And if you don't think this is accurate, push back. They said, if you disobey your parents, reject their wisdom, listen to your heart, neglect your responsibilities, give in to peer pressure, run away from home, go to your enemies for help, be discontent with who you are, change your appearance, chase after friendships, then deceive people into thinking something you are not, then in the end, you will save the day, be the hero, be appreciated for who you are, will be understood by your parents, and of course, loved by all for being beautiful on the inside and the outside. What concerns you more, that narrative that underlies it, or specifically some of these connections to the more modern conversation about trans?
Yeah, definitely the bigger worldview stuff is
Mm.
what concerns me most because again, the trans elements are not there overtly. They're more outworkings from those deeper worldview assumptions, like kind of what you just read about a young person who disregards their parents and rebels against their parents and runs off to find affirmation with friends and with Ursula and other characters. And I mean, those are the sorts of things that concern me, because a big part of the confusion around sexuality and transgenderism today, it really is connected to this changing sense of authority in our culture and in our families, and where we're like a young teenager who is hormonal and has got lots of like crazy things going on with their bodies, and their desires are ever changing. Like, we're saying that that person, that teenager, is to be trusted and affirmed and believed more than the adults around them and more than the community around them who might have something wise to contribute to that young person's direction in life. And that's kind of the assumption in our culture that is super problematic, and that's leading to these things like
Mm.
young teenagers changing their gender, because if the authority has shifted to young people know best who they are, to the point that even changing their bodies, if they feel that that's the right thing, is totally fine and encouraged even, that's a problem, I think, because young people are,
Mm.
everyone is left to their own devices. The heart is deceitful above all things, the Bible says. Like, left to ourselves, we don't know what's best for us, and
Mm.
going against our parents, going against our community, is not necessarily advisable. And just for the sake of love, or for the sake of some desire that we feel is so authentic and true, how could it be denied? even though that there's something in that that resonates with us on a human level, like how
Mm,
could we, it's so cruel to tell Ariel, no, that this desire is not something that is for you as a mermaid. It seems cruel, but maybe it's actually kind. Maybe it's actually loving.
mm,
Maybe maybe the limits that are placed around us are for our good. Um, so yeah, I mean, to go back to the Hans Christian Andersen history
mm.
here, he the first Little Mermaid ended differently. If anyone who's familiar with that initial story
Yeah,
versus the 1989 Disney version, very different endings, right? Like
very different.
in his story, it ends tragically because this desire isn't fulfilled, and it's the impossible nature of it remains impossible. And
Mm,
you can view that as a tragedy and something that Disney wants to change in the 1989 version, where she gets her happy ending and she really can be whatever she wants to be, and that desire should be affirmed. Or you can say, well, maybe Hans Christian Andersen, there was some wisdom in
mm,
the framing of this story as a tragedy, because that's life, because there are things that we want in life that we can't get. And that's just part of
mm.
life. And we can either accept that and learn from it, or we can say that it's wrong to ever be denied any desire that we have. And the good thing is always getting what we want. Um, and I think that just shows a shift in our culture where we've been so conditioned by this kind of consumeristic, me-centered, follow your heart,
Wow.
look within yourself posture, that we don't even question the good in getting what you desire. So
One of the other movies I showed my students was Maverick, of course, now one of the most popular films of all time. And what Maverick does is these young bucks think they know better, but the old guy still has some wisdom to pass on.
yeah,
And I love that shift. It's like, wow, there's something beautiful about older generations knowing things. And there's a vigor
right.
in youth, there's a dare in youth. Part of the question is, can Tom Cruise's character Maverick maintain his edge, but
Hmm.
settle down and get, married and have commitment? That's kind of the underlying question. So there's this youth, vigor, and desire to take risk that we don't want to lose. But when it
Yeah.
goes as far as The Little Mermaid, or arguably you see these themes in kind of Stranger Things, that
Hmm.
loses this idea that there's wisdom that's passed on and truth that's important,
Hmm.
that's where it becomes concerning. Now, we've got a few questions here. We've got
Hmm.
time for them. If you have a question, put question in caps, and we'll do
Hmm.
our best to respond. I'm curious your take on this one, Brett. This says, lots of questionable material in the cartoons I watched as a kid, born 1989, that I didn't pick up on until I was an adult rewatching. These Disney films are subtle. Are
Hmm.
parents overreacting? And by the way, I listen to some of the music I listened to, born in 76 in the 80s, and I'm like, dear Lord, what was I
Oh,
listening
for sure.
to? But how
Yeah.
much did it really affect me? So,
Yeah.
do you think parents are potentially overreacting to this stuff?
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's potentially true that we're overreacting because we look back on what we watched, like you just said, we're horrified. But I think given the choice between overreacting and underreacting, given where we're at as a culture and given the reality of these dynamics of movie studios stating out loud that they have an agenda in their movies, I think it's probably wise to err on the side of reading
Hmm.
more into something than
Hmm.
less. Now, I think you can go too far with that, and I wouldn't recommend just kind of this like, devil behind every bush approach where where you start saying you can't watch this,
Fair
you can't watch
enough.
this. But I just think in general it's a healthy thing to like think critically about the movies that we watch, and you know maybe this is just too nuanced for our cultural moment, but I think it's fine to watch something and say this part of it is wrong and unhelpful, but
Hmm.
this part of it is good. Like just like we've been talking about with The Little Mermaid, there are some commendable aspects, there are some virtues on display, and there are some negative things. Now, our culture is very much like all or nothing right now, where it's like you either boycott a film because it's the worst thing
Yeah.
ever, or you watch it uncritically and, love it. And I just think that's not the wisest approach, because most things in our culture, because they're made by humans and
Hmm.
humans are fallible, they're going to be a mixed bag of, some helpful things and maybe some unhelpful things.
Hmm.
And so that just invites us to be more critical in our viewing of things and more nuanced in our assessment of things, and to be able to watch something and appreciate what's good and dismiss and push back against what's bad.
Hmm. Here's a comment directed at me, but I want your thoughts. Somebody's obviously been tracking my stuff. Sardis says Dr. Sean listened to Depeche Mode, and they have a song called "Personal Jesus." Sounds blasphemous. So yes, for the record, my favorite '80s band was Depeche Mode, and to be honest with you, "Personal Jesus" is the least of the concerns. Now that I look back at some of Depeche Mode's songs, I look back at some ideas and I'm like, holy cow, what on earth was I thinking? Now, what is interesting, I don't think my dad would care. He literally bought me a Depeche Mode album, bought me an Oingo Boingo album, because there's one side that I hear these stories of people who bail on their faith, and it's like, I couldn't even watch the Smurfs. And so I think my parents did not want to be legalistic, but there's also the sense where you just do too much cultural engagement without discernment. And
Yeah.
I don't always know where that balance is at, but that
Yeah.
is my aim, to live in that tension. And I think for the most part, my parents did that pretty well. It
Hmm.
takes away this idea of the forbidden fruit. And
Yeah.
that's another reason why I was talking about this with my wife, and my 10-year-old son walked in and I was like, yeah, we're talking about The Little Mermaid. What do you think? Let's have a conversation. And just sparking that conversation, getting him thinking. He, like, his little 10-year-old brain is like connecting dots and didn't know how to do it. But to me,
Hmm.
that's just the balance that I think as Christians we want to try to aim to live in. So when it comes to this
Yeah.
movie, like, we should not be afraid of the ideas within it, but let's
Yeah.
always put it through a biblical lens, think Christianly about it, be
Yes.
gracious towards those who have made it, and just realize that at its core, we have a basic worldview difference that's
Hmm.
coming through in this film. Agree,
Hmm.
disagree? Your thoughts, Brett?
Yeah.
Actually, before you answer, did you listen to Depeche Mode? Be honest, don't play it off.
I didn't as much. I listened to it later in life,
All right.
in college. I kind of discovered the best of the 80s, but I think I'm a little bit younger than you, so maybe I missed the
Mm,
Depeche Mode in my youth, but
fair
I
enough.
do like Depeche Mode. Yeah, I would just say I agree with everything you just said. I think
Hmm.
there's when I look back at kind of the legalistic tendencies of my own evangelical upbringing in evangelical culture in the 80s and 90s, I went through a period in my 20s where I resented it, and I was kind of like, ah,
Mm,
why did I grow up in such a like anti-culture, environment? But the older I get, the more I
mm,
actually have come around to appreciate that, and
hmm,
actually see the value in that a bit more. Now, I do think it can be taken too far, where everything is taboo and everything is the forbidden fruit, that you're not setting your kid up well for being able to engage in that world. So I think having a mix of kind of openness to pop culture, but making it a conversation with your kids, like we've been talking about with The Little Mermaid, you know, feel free to watch it if that's what you decide as a parent, but be sure to like have that conversation about the themes, and ask questions like, you know, do you think that it would have been a happy ending if Ariel actually chose not to follow her desire?
mm,
Like, would that necessarily have been a sad ending if she had come to peace with her life as a mermaid
mm,
and maybe decided, I'm gonna find a merman husband and live
hmm,
and make that work? It's a fair question to ask, and you can take it on face value with The Little Mermaid, that of course the best thing was that she got Prince Eric, and they ended up together, and this kind of trans species romance ended up happening. But I don't know. I would ask, if I watched this movie with my kids, that would be a question I asked. Like, is it always tragic in life when we don't get the
Mm.
desire that feels so real and wonderful? So have those conversations, I would say. Just like think about good questions to ask your kids when you watch movies like this.
I love that. I try to engage my kids in the same way. So I've got one last question for you. But one thing I noticed is Sean Bailey, who's been hired by Disney to head up the live action remakes, has
Mm.
50 different films in various levels of production,
Wow.
all these Disney classics.
Yeah.
So we better think Christianly about these and wisely about these, not be
Mm-hmm.
reactionary, but
Mm-hmm.
also be wise in terms of how we respond. I think that's
Yeah.
vitally, vitally important. Here's a question for you. We'll end with this one, and then I'll let you go. I'd love to see how you weigh in this one. Mike Boy says, would you let your children watch any film, Disney, Netflix, etc., listen to music without supervision or prior viewing with a critical eye? Now, I'll tell you my thoughts, and then if you want to jump
Mm-hmm.
in this, my
Yeah.
answer is no, not any film. And partly the film, the first thing that I typically do on my better days is I just ask my wife and make sure we're on the same page, because I tend to be like, oh, let them watch it. And she often has much more wisdom and is like, maybe you haven't thought about this. So my
Mm-hmm.
wife and I try to get on the same page here. Second, it really depends on my kids' age and their maturity and the nature of the film. So there's
Mm-hmm.
no black and white way to always do this, but we just kind of gauge how much profanity is there, how much sexuality is there, how is it portrayed. So the Bible has acts of sexuality and violence, but it shows the consequences of that behavior rather
Mm-hmm.
than praising that behavior. So how is it portrayed? And then we do our best decision to do so with our kids. But with that said, the reality is, because there's so much access today, I
Right.
cannot filter everything my kids watch or their friends show to them.
Yeah.
So I just want to teach them discernment early on, so when they come across something, they have a biblical lens to look at it.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. What you just said
Hmm.
is how I would answer the question. Like, it's unrealistic to think that we can vet every single movie and every single piece of media that your child might come across, in their lives. There's too many platforms everywhere, too many places where they might come across it. And you can do your best to limit that. And you can kind of, you know, maybe you have a TV only in one room in your house and it's the only place they can watch something and it's a communal space. So you're always kind
Mm.
of around. There's things that you can do, but what happens when they're at their friend's house and you have no idea what they're watching. So the better route in the long run, what that will serve your child well, I think, is just setting them up to be wise in their critical assessment of things, and to have them asking these questions from a young age about
Mm.
what is the message that this movie is trying to say about, what is the good life, what is the purpose of life, what is happiness, what think just things like that. Every movie has an answer to that question, and to have that conversation will hopefully equip your child to be a more savvy, critical Christian viewer throughout their life.
Love it. I hope all our viewers can tell that you think about this a lot. I so appreciate your level-headed response to this. So even if folks disagree with you, if at times I read your blog and I'm like, yeah, I've got a different take than Brett, I know it's going to be gracious. I know it's going to be thoughtful. So I saw that you had a blog out today on Spider-Man and the multiverse, and I totally agree with your point. I won't steal your thunder. I want folks to go read it, but had I written a blog, hopefully it
Mm-hmm.
would have sounded like that. I was like, that's
Mm-hmm.
exactly my concern with some things in the
Yeah.
multiverse. So I hope folks will follow you at the Gospel Coalition. Well done. We'll have you back. Now, to those
Yeah.
watching, so a couple things. This is a little outside the norm of this channel, but if you want me to do more kind of worldview cultural analysis like this, just put a comment in there. And maybe it's, nope, Sean, stay in the apologetics lane, or, hey, we like this movie analysis. Either way, that feedback is just helpful to me to just better serve those who are engaged here in this community. And if you've ever thought about studying apologetics, would love to have you with us at Biola. Brett, you used to work there before you went to the Gospel Coalition. We were sad to see you go, but our apologetics program is the top rated in the world. And I've actually thought about doing a whole weekend course on film analysis and apologetics. At some point, I want to do that. So that information is below. If you've thought about, I'm not sure I'm ready for a master's, we actually have a certificate program. And below, there's a significant discount where we will just kind of walk you through the right lectures, basic assignments, just to get some content in apologetics. Would love to help. Would love to have you a part of us here at Biola. Brett, appreciate you, my friend. This is always fun. Thanks for carving out time to come on.
Yep, it was fun. Thanks, Sean.